Jinshi is beautiful, elegant, powerful, the kind of man you'd expect to be the romantic ideal, the prince in every core drama or fantasy story. But this isn't a fairy tale, and Jinshi isn't that prince. Because the deeper you get into the Apothecary Diaries, the more you realize this isn't a story of a perfect nobleman who saves the day. It's the story of a man who's had to weaponize every part of himself. His looks, his charm, even his silence, just to survive in a world where being beautiful make you a target. In most anime, characters like Jinshi are built to be fantasies. They exist to be admired, idolized, even longed for. But for Jinshi, that image is a cage. He doesn't get to be himself. He gets to be what everyone expects him to be. Graceful, composed, unbothered, because letting that image crack, even for a second, would mean losing the power it gives him. The longer he wears the mask, the harder it becomes to take off, and the more people fall for the illusion, the lonelier it gets. This video isn't about how perfect Jinshi is, it's about what it costs to look perfect, and what happens when someone finally sees through it. Let's start with the illusion everyone else believes, and how Jinshi learned to survive inside it. The first time Jinshi appears in the Apothecary Diaries is like the story stops to admire him. He is introduced as the palace's high-ranking eunuch, young, and dressed in layers of ceremonial authority. But that's not what people notice. What they see is someone almost too perfect. The kind of beauty that makes people pause. Servants freeze in his presence. Courtiers avoid direct eye contact. Whispers follow him down every corridor. No one really knows who he is, just that he must be important and dangerous. He's the one in charge of the inner court, but what people see is something else entirely. Someone too beautiful to be real. Even Maomao jokes that his face alone could start a war, and honestly you kind of believe her. And I'll be real, when Jinshi was introduced, I thought I had him figured out. I expected him to be that classic untouchable prince character, mysterious and flawless, someone who always seemed in control, always 5 steps ahead. A character who wasn't really human, but an icon meant to tower over everyone else. I actually liked that idea. I thought he'd be a fun contrast to Maomao, more fantasy than person. But what he became was so much more interesting, because Jinshi's perfection isn't effortless. It's intentional and carefully built. Everything from the way he wears his robes to the way he carries himself in a room is designed to project an image of control, composure, elegance. He knows his looks make people underestimate him or obsess over him, and he's learned to use that. It's not just beauty, it's a weapon. In episode 1, when he first meets Maomao, the moment feels like the setup for a romance. The beautiful official notices the plain servant. But it's not romantic, it's tense. Because instead of falling for the image like everyone else, Maomao just stares at him. Not in awe, not with admiration, with curiosity, like she's trying to solve him. And for once, he doesn't know how to respond. That's what makes Jinshi fascinating. He doesn't command attention because he's perfect. He demands it because he has to be. Because the moment the mask slips, everything underneath gets exposed. The pressure he's under, the expectations he carries, the quiet desperation to be taken seriously for more than his face. The illusion is beautiful, but it's also lonely. And now that we've seen it for what it is, the question becomes, what's underneath it? Jinshi's beauty draws everyone in, but it's also what keeps them at a distance. Because when people look at him, they don't see a person, they see a role. The elegant eunuch, the flawless official, the prince-shaped fantasy. He's constantly surrounded by people who either want something from him or fear what he represents. No one gets too close, no one sees past the surface. Except for Maomao. Not right away, not all at once, but slowly, episode by episode, she starts to notice the cracks in the performance. She sees how he plays to the expectations of others, how he hides behind the etiquette and grace and perfectly curated silence. And through her eyes, we begin to understand him. Jinshi isn't a perfect nobleman, he's someone pretending to be one. Behind the beauty is a man under pressure, a man born into status, tied to power he didn't ask for, forced to live under the constant weight of scrutiny. He's not a eunuch, that much becomes clear. But the palace believes he is, and he plays along because the alternative is worse. In a place full of spies and schemes and rival factions, the illusion of harmlessness is safer than the truth. It's why he smiles when he wants to scream, why he compliments when he'd rather confront, why he steps carefully through every interaction like it's a performance he can't afford to mess up. And what makes it even more complicated is that he's good at it. Jinshi knows how to use his image to shift conversations, to redirect attention, to stay in control. But that control comes at a cost. He can't afford to relax. He can't afford to be himself. Not really. There's a moment later in the series where he's in the office with Gaoshun, his most trusted confidant, and maybe the only person who sees him without the act. Jinshi slouches into his seat, his posture unguarded, his face stripped of charm or polish, and for just a few seconds, he stops performing. No elegance, no poise, just fatigue, just honesty, the kind of moment you only have when there's no one left to impress. That's when it sinks in. Jinshi doesn't live in a palace. He lives inside a role he didn't choose. And then there's Maomao again. She doesn't treat him like a prince. She treats him like a puzzle. Sometimes a nuisance, sometimes a mystery, but always like a human being. She's not charmed by his beauty. She's confused by it, frustrated by it, and completely uninterested in giving him the reaction he's used to. It drives him crazy, but it also changes him. Because Maomao is the first person who doesn't play along with the illusion. And for Jinshi, that is both terrifying and irresistible. It's the first time someone sees past a performance and reacts not to who he's pretending to be, but who he actually is. It's not a love story, not yet, but it's the sort of something that feels more real than anything else in his world. And that's where it gets interesting. Because if Jinshi's entire identity is built on being admired from a distance, what happens when someone finally gets close? Jinshi is used to being looked at, but never seen. That's a shift Maomao brings. From the moment they meet, she refuses to be impressed. Where others admire, she analyzes. Where others swoon, she squints. She doesn't see the prince, she sees the act. And for someone who spent his whole life being admired at a distance, that quiet scrutiny cuts deeper than any flattery ever could. It's one of the most fascinating dynamics in the Apothecary Diaries, because Jinshi, for all his grace and status, isn't a flawless romantic lead. He's complicated, a little awkward, sometimes entitled, sometimes unsure. He tries too hard or not at all, never quite knowing how to close the space between who he is and who people think he is. And I'll be honest, he's a bit of a controversial character because of that. Not disliked, but not always loved either. And I never really understood that. Yes, he acts weird sometimes. Yes, he is dramatic. But how could he not be? He grew up isolated, surrounded by high-ranking officials with no real peers. No one to laugh with, mess up with, or just be a kid around. So when someone like Maomao enters his world, someone who sees straight through the performance, but still doesn't quite know the full truth, it throws him into a kind of emotional limbo. And he doesn't know what to do with it. He's caught between the roles he's always played and the version of himself that only Maomao seems to notice. And that space between them, the tension, the awkwardness, the miscommunications, that's where something real starts to take shape. Because Maomao doesn't make it easy. She's blunt, detached, oblivious to every signal he sends. And he's not used to that. He's used to people bending toward him, not away. So he stumbles, fumbles, tries to impress her, then gets annoyed when it doesn't work. But still he keeps showing up, offering small pieces of his real self in quiet moments, hoping she might catch one and hold on to it. That's what makes their dynamic feel so grounded. It's not a palace romance built on longing looks and sweeping gestures. It's a slow, sometimes painful unraveling of two people who aren't supposed to understand each other, but somehow do. Jinshi's perfection was never effortless. It was armor, a carefully constructed image to keep the world from knowing how scared, lonely, and uncertain he really was. And Maomao, without even trying, starts to dismantle it piece by piece. Not with declarations of love, but with indifference, with honesty, with small, accidental kindnesses that stick with him longer than he wants to admit. Their story isn't resolved, their future isn't certain, but it feels real, because when someone finally sees you, not the version you perform, but the version you don't let anyone else touch, it changes you. And ready or not, that's exactly what's happening to Jinshi. He isn't the prince from a fairy tale. He's the boy who grew up pretending to be one, and that's what makes him unforgettable. Because once you see past the mask, you don't find perfection. You find a person trying, failing, reaching, just like the rest of them. And if you want to see how every character in this story carries the same weight, how no one is wasted, watch this next. Thanks for watching, like, subscribe, goodbye.